Hi everyone. So, for my content analysis, I chose to look at African American culture in films. More specifically, what I wanted to look at was how African American culture is portrayed by the media, as well as the historic backgrounds that they are able to inform us about while we're still being entertained. I found a few different research articles that had helped me decide on this culture. One of the articles that really solidified it for me was about how racism was extremely prominent in the filmmaking industry during the 1940s while civil rights movements were underway. However, when the issues were no longer majorly being presented in society, then the racism in the movies stopped as well. I found that this trend has continued throughout history, and when the African Americans are trying to fight for literally anything, the filmmaking industry profits off of making negative stereotypes against them. This made me want to see what African Americans had to go through in their lives throughout history by watching both credible and non credible movies about African American culture. I chose a variety of films. A couple of them were meant to entertain us with no educational background and cultural misconceptions. I watched a few different films that were based on true stories and that were able to help show what African Americans went through because of the color of their skin. Some examples that I saw that they had to deal with simply due to the color of their skin were slavery, rape, being beaten, fighting to just stay alive, not being able to get a job or get insurance when there's life threatening circumstances happening, trying to better themselves, but being slandered because of their ethnicity, and so much more. One of the films that stuck out with to me most is called 12 Years a Slave. The reason this stuck with me so much is because it is so horrific and something I never even imagined possible, and it was based off a true story. The movie is about a free African American male who is offered a 2 week position on a tour to play his fiddle. When the tour is over and the white people he was traveling with earned their money, they took him out to dinner. They got him obliteratingly drunk. He was throwing up everywhere. He couldn't even stand. Like, they had to carry him up the stairs. Like, they did this on purpose. Like, you could see in the movie, they kept filling up his glass and they never filled up their own, and they were sipping on it, drinking water, while he thought that they were getting drunk with him. And then the next thing he knew, he was locked up, chained up. All of his belongings, including his free paperwork showing that he was a free person, were gone. And the men had sold him into slavery. From there, he was beaten beyond imaginable. He was once hung from a tree by his neck to the point where he was on mud and he was standing on his very tippy toes and sliding back and forth, trying to stay alive and holding himself up. And they left him there from dawn to dusk. It was completely sickening and gross, but this movie stuck with me because this was his form of life for 12 years. He was completely separated from his wife, his children, and when he finally got free and his people found him, he never got justice for the people who took him and sold him into slavery. He took them to court, but since he was a black man, they dropped the case and that was that. So he eventually started helping people against the Underground Railroad and like getting people out of slavery and like that kind of thing. So that movie really stuck with me because it's all based on a true story and what people had to go through and the sickening things we saw in that movie. It was just crazy. Another movie that stuck with me was called Glory. And this movie is based off of a true story as well. And this is when African Americans had become able to enlist in the Civil War. So it was a little bit of a lighter side of a movie compared to the movies I had been watching about slavery and then like the punishments and just all the different rape scenes and all that stuff that I had been seeing. So this was a lighter side, because this movie showed that the African Americans were able to get into the military, they were able to train, and they were happy. They were doing something they thought was right. However, not all plus sides to this, because at the beginning, like, none of the soldiers accepted them. They were beating them. They were being super harsh, and they made them train in terrible conditions. They refused to give them new clothes, so they were still wearing their slave clothes when they were beginning their training. Some of them didn't have shoes, and so like their feet were blistered and boiled and skin peeling off because they refused to give them shoes. But eventually one person began to stand up for them and got them new uniforms, got them new shoes, and they were able to go into their first battle after that, and they fought and everything, and they refused to give up, and the whites saw that they were refusing to give up when they wanted to retreat until they actually won that battle, and that kind of solidified them into the Civil War as like, oh, you guys are actually here to help, you guys are worth it, like you're good. And by the end of it, they were all being cheered on as they were going into their final battle, and all of the other men were taking their hats off to them, and you could just see the pride and joy in everyone's face for being able to serve in the military and do what they needed to do to help history on that side. So that movie really stuck out with me because that was another perspective of, as opposed to being in slavery, it's them trying to end slavery. So that was kind of cool to see, especially since it was based off a true story as well. And then I also watched some movies that were not credible, I would say. The two movies that I watched that I saw were very not credible were Friday and White Chicks. Because I watched these as well because I wanted to see the difference in how these stories were versus true stories and what Hollywood believes is what African Americans' lives are like versus what they actually are from the true movies that I saw. And for the movie Friday, as I'm sure most of you know, but they show that African Americans are gang members, they want to get into fights, they're poor, they view women as objects, and they have so many different negative stereotypes going on in this movie because they're trying to make it a fun, entertaining one. But if you actually look at how they're portraying African Americans, it's insane. Like, all they're doing is being very negative towards them and how they are and what you would think the absolute worst in someone, that's what that would be. And so I don't think this movie was very good in that aspect because it not only allows everyone to confirm their beliefs in it when they watch these kind of movies, but it also doesn't allow anyone the opportunity to really change their mind about how they view African Americans because it's kind of solidifying what they see and what they think. But as for White Chicks, this one was a little interesting to me. I've watched it many, many times, but I never really watched it from like looking at different cultural aspects. So it really was interesting to watch it again because I noticed a role reversal of the two African American males pretending to be two white females and allowing them to act how they feel white females are and how they would act in any situation they were put into. I thought this was an interesting reversal because it allowed the media not only to show the stereotypes of African Americans, but it allowed it to show what African Americans view whites as and how they think that they act in situations, even if that's not really how they would act. I chose these films because I wanted to see some films that were credible and some that were specifically designed for entertainment. I wanted to see the difference between the styles of films, but I also was very curious about some of the movies that were credible because I don't ever think we can know enough about history and what everyone has been through in order to just survive. I chose the movies that I thought would show African American culture within the movies, whether it was credible or negative stereotypes, and that would show how either we view them or what has actually happened to them to show how that culture's kind of been built. I wanted to be able to see all the different areas of history and how Hollywood has shown the world of history over the years. I found it to be extremely interesting that the movies I chose represented African American culture. They were still not the dominant ethnicity within the majority of the films. The percentage of African Americans within the films were there was 26% African Americans in The Blind Side, 27% in John Q, 33% in The White Chicks, 38% in The Help, 48% in Higher Learning, 49% in Glory, 51% in 12 Years a Slave, 53% in Remember the Titans, 79% in Malcolm X, and 86% in Friday. Half of the films I watched, less than half of the actors and actresses were African American. They were prominently white and some Hispanic. But I just thought that was very interesting that I was watching films about African American culture, but the African American culture wasn't the prominent ethnicity within the movie. That was a little strange to me. So in my conclusion, what I have found within these films is that there are many negative stereotypes against African Americans. Within the films that are based on true stories showed the history of African Americans and what they had to go through to educate people on racism, slavery, and everything else they had to do in order to survive. I thought the films that were based on true stories helped me a lot better to even just somewhat understand or learn a little bit more, educate myself a little more, I guess, on what happened during slavery, trying to end slavery, after slavery, and even further after, with how much African Americans still have to endure just because of the color of their skin and the different hardships. It's just, I don't think I'll ever fully be able to understand it, but I feel like these films did give me a little bit more background and education to help me understand a little bit more as to what they went through, I guess. I do believe the movies that try to show history and knowledge about racism help us to understand a fraction more about their culture, as opposed to the entertaining movies that show others what they think about the worst in the culture. It doesn't allow for others to view change in a positive way. I think that the non-credible movies do help in a sense to show what negative things we see about people in any culture, but I don't think it really helps to be able to change the views, because media is so prominent in our lives that we do see something and we're like, okay, yeah, no, that has to be truth. And as opposed to where you see the based on a true story ones where these were actual people's lives, but those don't get viewed as often as the funny comedy, here's this, and with all the negative stereotypes in it. So I think we can do better as a society with that. But overall, I do think that this assignment helped me to understand the difference of whenever I'm seeing a funny movie, to know the difference between that's just a movie and not just how everyone is as a culture, and see the true stories as to what actually happened and how people had to deal with things, and some of the things they had to do just to survive is just beyond me. But that's my content analysis and what I've seen and what I think about it. Hope you guys enjoyed.